Hi, what I'm going to show you in this session is how to set up and do a basic demo of 3PAR's file persona, which will provide file services capability natively from the 3PAR array. 3PAR file persona is available with any 3PAR 7000 series that is denoted with a C, like the 7450C or the 7200C. It is also available with the whole 8000 or 20000 family of 3PAR arrays. Functionality and user interface will be virtually identical between any of the 3PAR arrays. The only requirement is the array needs to be licensed for file persona, and the node pair needs to have the file persona NIC HPAs installed. So let's go ahead and get started. What I want to show you is how to create a configuration for file persona from the ground up with nothing configured. The only thing configured so far is that the array is licensed and the nodes have the NICs already on them for file persona. So right now you're looking at the dashboard. So what we'll do is go to the mega menu just like any other demo. We'll start at the mega menu to navigate, and we'll go ahead and go down to the file persona column. You'll see that there are 5 items under the file persona column, and these are the items that we'll go through to create a configuration. So the first thing is we'll go down to the file persona configuration and set it up. What you'll see is that nothing is configured so far. So down here you look at the controller nodes and they say it's all disabled. Right here you see that the array is yellow and it is also disabled, showing that file services is not running. But you do see that it is licensed. So the first thing we'll do is go ahead and create a configuration by going to Actions and Configure File Persona. I'll get a window that will appear and it will guide me through my configuration. What you'll notice is that under node pairs, I have 2 pairs that I can use to configure file persona. I can do the first 2 under node 0 and 1 or node 2 and 3. I can do all 4 if I want, but for our sake we're just going to do the first 2 just for simplicity and see what happens. So for node 0 and 1, I'm going to go ahead and configure it by clicking on this icon here. And I'm going to change this to configure, and then I'm going to add an IP for this node pair. So make sure you have plenty of IPs to use because you'll need them for the nodes themselves as well as the virtual file servers later on. So let's go ahead and click on add, and I see the NIC pair that is available for configuration. I'll click on add, and then under node 0 IP address, I'll enter the IP that I want to use. I'll enter my IP address 192.168.57.100, and then the other node I'll apply an IP address as well, 101. Then I will simply say OK. Next we're going to set our mask and our gateway, so let's go ahead and do that. And notice up here you can do advanced options, and then what you can do is enable a VLAN tag or set NTU size for jumbo frames, or even change your bond mode. But we're going to leave everything as default and keep it simple for now. So I'm going to uncheck this, and then we'll go ahead and take a look at what else we need to do. So you see DNS settings. So if you want to set DNS servers, you can do that. You can also set suffixes, and also Active Directory configuration is down below if you want to configure that as well. But again, we'll keep it simple for our demo, and we're going to go ahead and say configure. It can take anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes to complete. So for the sake of this video, we're just going to go ahead and come back when it's done. For your demo with a customer, what you'll typically do is have this done already, and then you'll have it prepared for them, and then the rest of the demo they can see how everything else is set up. Okay, we're back, and the file persona configuration is now complete. So what you'll notice now is that the system is showing as green for file persona configuration. You'll have 2 nodes that are showing as running. The other 2 nodes are not running because we did not configure that yet. And you'll see up here that everything is in a state of OK as well. You can also look at the different parameters of your configuration, from authentication settings for your different users. You can see your antivirus settings. In this case, we don't have anything set up. We can go down and look at the various network settings And you can also go down and look at the mapping as well. So you have the 3-power array, the file persona configuration, which includes 2 of the 4 nodes, which is why you see green, green, and these are grayed out. And also I'll point you to one other item, which is the CPG. If you go to CPG, you'll notice there is now a new one that says FS CPG. So it's a CPG that's automatically created, and inside that CPG there are 3 volumes. And when you open it up, you'll see that there's a FS Quorum, which is the quorum volume that you'll be using for your virtual file servers later. And then there are these boot volumes, which will be the boot volumes for those file servers. And you'll see what I mean in the next few steps. So let's go back to our configuration. So with file persona configuration running, the next thing we want to do is go to the mega menu, and you see as you move up the layer, the next thing you would want to do is create a file provisioning group. A file provisioning group is something that is required, but you don't have to go in and create this step. It can be automatically created for you if you go in and create a virtual file server. But for the sake of thoroughness, we're just going to go through every step, and then I'll go back and show the simpler way to do it. So first, we'll go in, like I said, and do the file provisioning group. And right now, there's nothing created. So just to give you an idea of what this file provisioning group does, think of it as a CPG. Let's take a look at the diagram here of how things are placed within the whole file persona configuration. You have your array with this file persona configuration. You also have CPGs wide striping across the drives. You then have file provisioning groups that would associate and be linked with a CPG and a node. Since a file persona group is tied to a node, it is a unit of failover between nodes. Then you would have virtual file servers that would be created and linked to a specific file provisioning group. The virtual file server is essentially your appliance that will perform file services. It would have IPs that you would connect to connect to a network share. Okay, so now let's go back to SSMC and create a file provisioning group. I'm going to click on the create button. I'm going to give it a name. So I'm just going to call it something simple, FPG1. And then down here I'm going to choose some of the parameters for this file provisioning group. So let's say I want this file provisioning group to have characteristics like thin provisioning. I can choose that. I can choose any of the other provisioning types as well. So anytime I create a virtual file server and shares using this file provisioning groups, it'll take on these characteristics. So then I'm going to also choose a CPG, so I can choose any one of the CPGs available. So let's say I want to do SSD RAID 5, for example. Any shares or volumes created from this later on will take on SSD RAID 5. And then I'm going to give it a size, and it's going to be at 1 terabyte increments. So I'm just going to choose the minimum 1 terabyte. And down here, I'm going to be able to choose a node if I want. So remember, I can associate a node with this file provisioning group. So if I select here, I will be able to choose node 0 or 1. Or I can also let it do auto select, which is what I'll do in this case. And then I will go ahead and click create, and it'll go ahead and create my file provisioning group. We'll let that finish. And there we have our file provisioning group. So if we take a closer look here, we see that it is a file provisioning group that is on node 0. If it does fail over, it will go on to node 1. In terms of capacity, nothing has been used. We can also go into the virtual volumes, and you'll notice that there is a new volume that was created, and it is called FPG_1 with that .1 in there, and that's sitting on CPG SSD R5. So these are the parameters we chose when we created this virtual volume group. So the next logical step now is to create a virtual file server. So we'll go to our mega menu, and we'll go to virtual file servers. And again, there's nothing here, so we'll go ahead and create one. I'm going to go create virtual file server. I'm going to enter a name, VFS, for virtual file server. I'll do a 1 with it. I can enter some comments if I want. And then down here under storage allocation settings, I can enter a CPG and then a size. So if I choose a CPG of, let's say, RAID 5 SSD, and then say set a size to 1 terabyte. This is very similar to what we just did, if you notice, in the file provisioning group parameter. So you can do this by setting it here, or you can actually choose advanced options up here and then select the file provisioning group that we had just created a few steps before this. So let's go ahead and do that, and then we'll choose the file provisioning group, and that's the one we just created. We'll say select, and we can then go ahead and move on to the next step. I want to point out that the reason they have this here is that there's two ways of doing it. One's more simplified and one offers you a little bit more control. So what we're doing is the more advanced way of doing it, so you can have a little bit more control where you choose the file provisioning group and you separate it out from the file server. We're going to go back and do a simple way afterwards so you can see the difference later on when you're doing an actual demo. You can choose whichever way you want to do it. Okay, so next is the networking. So we're going to enter the IP address for the virtual file server, and we're going to do 192.168.57.110 to a mask of 255.255.255.0, and we're not going to have any VLAN tagging in this setup, so we're just going to say add. And down here you can set antivirus scanning settings if you want, and then you can also enter the vendor information for the antivirus setting, and the rest is simple. Just say create, and then you will have your virtual file server. And there is our virtual file server. So let's take a look. You'll see that the IP address to access this virtual file server is 192.168.57.110, which is what we set when we created this. And you see that there's a file store created for administrative purposes, and then there is file shares. So to create a share, we can go ahead and click file share. I do want to quickly point out that there's a file store which sits underneath the file share. So if you recall, let's go back to our diagram. After you create a virtual file server, you can then create a file store on top of it. A virtual file server can have many file stores, and a file store can have multiple shares. Lastly, a file store is the granularity of which you can take a snapshot. If you take a snapshot of a particular file store, all the shares in that file store will be snapped along with it. Okay, now let's go back to our virtual file server. So if you want, you can take a look at what the file store looks like, and we can click on file store, and you'll see the name of the file store is called admin. There's the actual path to this file store, so that's the file provisioning group. There's the virtual file server, and then there's the file store. So at this point, we can now go ahead and create a file share. So we can do that by clicking on this. Or if you want, we can go back to the mega menu, and you can see the progression of steps that we went through. We had the configuration, file provisioning group, virtual file servers, the file store that we can go in and create manually, or we can go into the file shares and create a file share, which would automatically create the file store for us. So let's go ahead and do this so you can see what I mean. When the window opens, you first choose what type of share you want, NFS, SMB, or object share. So we're going to choose SMB because I'm going to connect from a Windows box. Then we'll give it a share name. So let's call this share 1. Then that's the system 1, so we're fine. Again, options for comments if you like. And then down here under share path, we're going to choose the virtual file server. So that's the one we have already. We can select other ones if they exist, but for us we only have one, so we'll just continue with that. And then in terms of file store, it'll automatically create a file store for you. If you created a file store beforehand, then you can also select that. So for us, we didn't create any file stores. We're just going to use this one that it'll create on its own, so we'll do that. And now you have the subdirectory path. So that's the file provision group, that's the file server, and that's the file store, and then that is the share we're creating. And down here you can apply various client lists and permissions and also various settings. So we're going to go ahead and add some permissions for some users to connect. So we're going to go in and say add, and I'm going to allow the administrator to connect, and I'll say full control for the administrator. Then we'll say add, and then complete. And there is our new share that we can connect to. So let's go ahead and connect to it, but before we do that, I want to check one thing, which is to check the users. I don't think we did that yet, but we have to go to our users and enable them. So I'm going to go to my persona configuration, and then what we'll do is go to actions and take a look at our local users. And you see that there's some default local users here, and I'm going to log in with administrator, but I see that's not disabled, and that's by default. So you'll have to go in and make sure it's enabled. So I'm going to go in here and enable it, and also give it a login. And say OK. Now it will be configured. So once it's configured, we can then go ahead and map to the drive. So let's go ahead and do that. Going down to my computer, we'll go ahead and try to map it, and this is the IP address we're going to connect to, which is 110, the one we used earlier. And then we will browse, and that's the share. We'll say OK. We'll make sure we use the correct credentials. And this is one thing you do have to pay attention to. If you are connecting to the local user, you have to make sure that it says local cluster as the domain, and it's going to be administrator. Depart data, the login, and say OK. And that is our share. So now you can use this network drive as a typical share that you would use in any network drive. Okay, so we just completed a file persona configuration from the ground up, all the way from nothing created to a file share. So the next thing I want to do is show you a more simple way of going about this. Earlier we went through every single layer so I can show you what all the different layers mean. But now I want to show you another way of doing it if you are going to demo to a customer, is that you can go in to SSMC, go to the mega menu, and you'll notice that under file persona you have all these different layers that we talked about. If you want, you can go into settings, and you can actually simplify that by going into the file persona management. You can edit that to say disabled, which means all the advanced options are going to be disabled. So I'm going to say OK now. And if you go back to the mega menu, you'll only see 3 of the layers, which is the configuration, the file servers, and the file share. All the other layers in between, specifically the file provisioning group and the file store, will be automatically created when you go through these steps. So let's go ahead and do that so you can see what it looks like without those layers in between. So since we already have the persona configuration created, we don't have to do that all over again. All we have to do now is go into the virtual file server, create the virtual file server from here, and we'll create another one called VFS2. And then we will this time, instead of choosing a file provisioning group, we'll just go ahead and directly enter a CPG here. And let's say we this time want to do SSD RAID 1. And we want this to be this time 2 terabytes. And we will then add a network IP. .111. We'll do the same subnet mask. We'll add, and the rest we'll keep at default and say create. And there we have our new virtual file server number 2. And if we highlight it, just like before, it will have a file store created that is called the admin file store. Right, so we didn't have to create that. That'll be created for you. And if we go back to our virtual file server again, at this point, all we have to do next is create a file share. So we'll go ahead and go up to file share. and create another share, and we'll do the same thing, and we'll call it share 2, and we will select virtual file server number 2, and we'll create a new one called home. It'll automatically create it called home for you, and we'll say create. And there is our second share. And if we go ahead and take a closer look here, we have the share 1 that was the original one, and that was coming from the file provision group 1, then the virtual file server 1, home, and then share 1. Now if we go to share 2, the actual file provision group is going to be the same name as the virtual file server. So it's going to be VFS2, and then VFS2 is the actual virtual file server name as well, and then home, and then share 2. Oh, and I did forget one thing, which was to enable the user for share 2, which is going into actions, we can edit, and down here under the permissions, I've forgotten to do this earlier. Just like before though, we just add admin administrator, and we can give the administrator full control, and then we'll say OK, and then we're just identical to share 1 in terms of creating this, with the differences being the file provision group being a little different. So if we wanted to see what the file provision group looks like for share 2, just as I said, it's going to be called VFS2. So if we go to here and change the setting back to what it was before, just so we can see what it looks like, we'll just enable this again, say OK. And now if we take a peek at the file provision group, earlier the first one we created on our own, the second one, the VFS2, was created